circle is finally here. I know everybody been waiting for it, right?
I am ready to do more Throwback Thursday, and we're going to go quite a bit back. That's right. A film called Rope, an Alfred Hitchcock film that many of you may not be familiar with. Obviously, these monster classics that people know and love so well. Obviously, things like Psycho and Birds and films of that nature. Obviously, this film came out in 1948. Obviously, Jimmy Stewart is the title character, or at least he's the big star. He's not really. I mean, he's kind of the third main character, to be perfectly honest. He plays Rupert Cadell, who's a professor of these two guys, basically that were in school. That were classmates and fans and inspired by his teachings. So the brilliance of the film centers around the fact that Hitchcock used full reels of film, 10 minutes at a time for each take, and then he threads them together. There's shots. You'll see constantly people are walking in front of the camera. So it goes black. That's when they're changing out tapes, putting their edits in. So the hour and a half or so of the film is in real time. Like you're there at this party, this gathering, which we'll get to, during this situation where it begins with Philip and Brandon committing this murder of their friend David. And I say friend because it's like the perfect murder. It's like no one would suspect them. They're inspired based on Rupert's teaching, this Nietzsche philosophy of like Superman, right? The superior minds, and they strangle him. And they put him in this large trunk right there in the room. They cut ultimately. This is all dialogue driven, but they cover it. They serve their food there. They come up with all these reasons and excuses. And Brandon in particular is very, very malice and very, very harsh, whereas Philip is really disturbed by all this. The tension, even between them, is very, very high, right? The rope they strangle him with is put into a kitchen drawer. And the tensions, it's all based on different relationships. People coming for this gathering. It's like a farewell get together because Philip's going to go away to do some the work on this farm, do writing or something. But the foreshadow is about Rupert showing up because he's their inspiration and him being invited almost as a way of challenging whether or not they were able to accomplish this perfect murder, right? And Rupert doesn't even show up. It's like 30 minutes, like 30 minutes into this. And you have, it's the only time when he first arrives, it's the only time to that point where Brandon kind of breaks a little bit and seems a little nervous, right? Rupert's character. So in the photo, you have different characters that are there for this gathering. So you have David's parents. You have the love interest, David's love interest is there. And you have this Mrs. Wilson, who is basically like their like maid, or I'm not exactly sure what her role is to Brandon in particular, but that's what she's there for, right? And the dialogue is always about setting up things that constantly increase the tension in the scene, because you realize that the dead body is right there in the trunk this whole time, right? And at one point, they prompt a situation about death. And Philip, there's a joke that Brandon does on purpose about not killing a chicken, right? Not being willing to properly, kill a chicken. And everyone is really put off. But Rupert, though, goes on this long-winded diatribe about like why murders. Well, basically, it's like a population control conversation about superior people, right? And it's about like, maybe there should be a cutthroat a week and strangulation days and all this other stuff, right? And David's dad goes completely crazy, going, no, whoa, your arrogance is very much like this little guy with a funny mustache in Germany, right? But this is the philosophy that the film is sort of testing, this concept. And they have this sort of like upper class white elitist thinking that they would always be on the winning side of these arguments. They would never be the one that would be at the end of that rope, basically, right? Now, David's dad is going to take these books that Brandon has for him, and Brandon actually ties them up with the rope to give them to him at one point. It's absolutely crazy. It's brilliant. So anyway, so as they're going along, though, there's little notes and things like that that start to clue Rupert in that something's not quite right. David being gone, not showing up, no call, no one knows where he is. They're calling mom because she's getting worried, and the girlfriend is worried. And then Mrs. Wilson tells Rupert something about how Philip and Brandy were behaving odd that day, right? And then Philip, who's playing on a piano, Rupert's like pushing. And during this time, the tension is rising and rising and rising. More things are getting taken off the trunk. More things are becoming clear. It becomes very easy to open this trunk. There's nothing else on top of it, right? And they had to come up with a reason to even put stuff on the trunk to begin with. That wouldn't be normal, right? They would normally eat with at a fancy table. So the dialogue continues, and the camera just stays at one point right there on the trunk. And Mrs. Wilson is clearing stuff away, taking away food, taking away the candles, taking stuff away. Now, off camera, what would be to the right of the camera, the characters are in excruciating detail about where David could be. And he's right there in the trunk. Like, you in the audience are like, holy cow. It's like this. Your mind is in such conflict because you're like, oh my gosh, he's right there. They're saying all these things. He's right there, right? Now, when Mrs. Wilson comes back, she's putting the books away. And when she does, she starts to open it where Brandon stops. And then Rupert is involved with that too. And he kind of is, again, picking up the pieces of the stress. And, they start to think, well, we should call the police. Maybe he's been in an accident. Maybe he's been hurt. And we're right around about an hour. Right, we're getting close to the end here, and you're like, oh my gosh, they're going to get away with this. They start to send everybody away. Mrs. Wilson gives, is helping with this process. They give Rupert the hat, and this is where you get the first big reveal. You're like, oh, they're going to get caught. Because when Rupert gets his hat, he looks down, and the initials are DK, which are David's initials, right? But he leaves. Everyone leaves. Brandon is like, he's on cloud nine. He thinks they won. They send Mrs. Wilson away because Philip's got to get ready to go to this farm. That's how they're going to get rid of the body. And they call for the driver or whatever. And when they get a call back, they realize it's not the driver, it's Rupert. Rupert wants to come back up because he, quote, left something behind, right? And here they know that something's not quite right, but they don't know what's going on. They don't know if Rupert does know. Philip is losing it. Brandon, at least at this point, slaps him. The tension goes through the roof. The performances and stuff in this are really, really underrated for these two young men. And Rupert, of course, he's piecing stuff together about David's demise, and he starts throwing it out there like a hypothetical. And Brandon's meandering, and Rupert kind of calls him out on having a gun in his hand, gun in his pocket. And the gun's tossed aside, kind of like a jest, whatever. And the rope is pulled out of Rupert's pocket, like he knows. Now Philip panics, and he has the gun. And they start fighting over the gun. There's a little bit of a back and forth, and the gun goes off. And he says, I'm going to look in this trunk. And finally, there's like, go ahead. I hope you like what you see. And then, of course, there's horrors. And Brandon's like, well, let me explain. And it's the same thing as what we had before. It's like Brandon is the disciple of Rupert. These are inferior beings. There's moral concepts of right and wrong, but that doesn't hold the same for the intellectually superior. We lived out what you taught us, what you talked. You have to understand. And there's like a crisis of faith. There literally is a crisis of faith for the character to be face to face with what they have done. And he says, you've thrown your own words back at me. You've thrown my own words. You gave me meaning to my words. The ugliness, there's no excuse for this ugly murder. And I'm ashamed of everything. And I want to thank you for that shame. Because now I realize we're each separate human beings. And what gives you the right to decide how this boy was in fear. Why do you get to play God? And, you served food from his grave, things like that. Now, the very ending, I didn't care for as much as I rewatched it. He fires gunshots in the air. There's no phone call to get the police coming. You hear the sirens closing in as basically Brandon fixes a drink. And man, I tell you what, it was kind of unnerving to revisit a film like this. And I don't know if this is for everyone. I think it's definitely kind of more like a nerdy cinemaphile kind of film because it's all dialogue. It's very much like mystery and intrigue and thriller, not action or anything like that. It is, it felt like I was dealing with like exposition of like Twitter crazy people who feel like so many other people are disposable humans and don't have rights, and they feel like they should get to decide the livelihood or how certain people's major life decisions get made. And this film really dealt with that. And this is 75 years ago. I was just, that really, really sunk in with me. It was really kind of heavy on my mind and my heart as I rewatched this, was how beautiful of a film this is with the tight script and the cinematography and all that. And this is not considered a top tier Hitchcock film. It's definitely more like a film school appreciation kind of thing. So that's why I chose it. I thought it was something a little bit different, a little bit outside the norm. Maybe it's not for all of you, but I thought maybe there'd be a couple who thought, well, I'll give it a go. And you guys can tell me what you think. If you've seen it or not, maybe you just love Jimmy Stewart. That's fine too. Hitchcock. You guys tell me what you think. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you're enjoying Throwback Thursday as we talk about old films. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Pops.